It was a bright morning in the city, the kind where sunlight hits the glass buildings just right and makes everything look golden. The coffee shop on the corner was packed as usual, filled with the smell of roasted beans and the soft hum of chatter. People stood in line, half awake, scrolling through their phones or talking quietly. Among them was a man named David. He wore a clean white shirt and a calm smile as he waited patiently for his turn. David had a meeting later that morning, but he wasn't in a rush. He liked this small coffee shop because it felt peaceful. The workers there knew him by face and he always greeted them politely. As he reached the counter, he ordered his usual, a black coffee and a toasted bagel. The young barista behind the counter smiled and said she'd have it ready in a minute. Behind David stood a woman, middle-aged, dressed neatly, but her face showed impatience. She tapped her fingers on the counter and sighed loudly. Every few seconds she checked her watch, as if time itself was testing her. When David stepped slightly to the side to grab his wallet, she muttered something under her breath. But he didn't catch it. The barista called out David's name, and he leaned forward to make sure the order was correct. He smiled kindly, saying, "Thanks, I appreciate it." But before he could move aside, the woman behind him suddenly raised her voice. "Are you done yet? Some of us have places to be," she snapped. David turned around, surprised but still calm. He said softly, "Sorry, I just wanted to make sure they got the order right." The woman rolled her eyes and muttered again, this time louder so everyone could hear. "People like you always take your sweet time. Maybe you should just go back to Africa or wherever you came from." The words hit the air like a slap. The coffee shop went silent. The barista froze, her hand halfway to the counter. A few people looked down, pretending not to hear, while others stared in shock. David stood still, the smile gone from his face. For a moment, he couldn't even believe what he'd just heard. He looked at her, his eyes steady but sad. There were so many things he could have said, so many ways he could have reacted. But instead, he simply said, "I'm sorry you feel that way," and quietly picked up his cup. The woman scoffed, folding her arms like she had won some invisible argument. David didn't reply. He walked to an empty table near the window and sat down, his hands wrapped around the warm cup. The chatter in the room didn't return right away. The air felt thick, heavy with tension. A young couple at another table exchanged uncomfortable glances. The barista's eyes darted toward David, guilt flickering across her face. She wanted to say something, but her voice wouldn't come out. The woman who had spoken so cruelly sat down with a huff, scrolling through her phone as if nothing had happened. David stared out the window for a few seconds, trying to steady his thoughts. He wasn't new to hearing cruel words, but no matter how many times it happened, it still hurt. Not because of the insult itself, but because it reminded him that some people still couldn't see past the color of his skin. He took a slow sip of his coffee, forcing himself to breathe. He told himself, "Don't let this ruin your day." His grandmother used to tell him, "You can't control what others say, but you can control how you answer." So he chose silence, not weakness. Across the room, the barista finally gathered the courage to do something. She took a small plate from behind the counter and placed a fresh pastry on it. Then she walked over to David's table. Her voice was soft when she said, "This one's on the house." David looked up, surprised. "You don't have to." "I want to," she said. "I'm really sorry for what happened." He gave her a gentle smile. "Thank you. That means a lot." For a moment their eyes met, and something silent passed between them. A shared understanding that kindness still existed, even when the world showed its harsh side. A man sitting near the corner had seen the entire thing. He had pulled out his phone during the argument, not to embarrass anyone, but to make sure there was proof of what had been said. His hands shook slightly as he pressed record. He couldn't believe that in a city as diverse as this, such words could still be spoken. David didn't know he was being filmed. He wasn't thinking about that. He was thinking about how words once spoken couldn't be taken back. He had a choice now. He could leave quietly, or he could stay and show that he wasn't afraid to exist in a space where someone told him he didn't belong. He decided to stay. Minutes passed. The woman occasionally glanced in his direction but avoided direct eye contact. Some people in the shop whispered to each other, their voices low but their eyes full of judgment. Not for David, but for her. Still, no one said anything aloud. David opened his laptop, trying to focus on his work. The screen glowed softly in front of him, but his thoughts wandered. He remembered his father telling him once, "The world tests your character in small moments. How you respond shows who you are." He typed a few words, then stopped. He looked around the cafe, at the quiet barista cleaning the counter, the couple pretending to read their phones, the man with his coffee halfway to his mouth. Everyone had witnessed it, yet everyone struggled to know what to do. He understood that too. People were scared to speak up, afraid to make things worse. Then something unexpected happened. The man who had been recording stood up. He walked toward the woman's table, his voice calm but firm. "Ma'am," he said, "I think what you said earlier was really uncalled for." The woman looked up sharply. "Excuse me?" He nodded slowly. "Yes, excuse you. You shouldn't talk to anyone like that. We're all just people trying to get through our day." Her face turned red. She started to say something, but the words caught in her throat. The man didn't raise his voice, but there was something in his tone that made others finally look up from their screens. The barista added quietly, "He's right." The woman looked around and realized every pair of eyes in that cafe was now on her. For a moment, the power she thought she had disappeared. She muttered something under her breath and looked away. David didn't speak. He didn't need to. The moment spoke for itself. He felt something shift inside the room. People who had stayed silent now looked at him differently. Not with pity, but with respect. The man who had stood up returned to his seat, nodding at David as if to say, "I see you." David gave him a small nod back. He didn't want anger to win, not today. When he finally finished his coffee, he packed his laptop and stood up. He looked at the barista and said softly, "Thank you again." "You didn't have to do that, but it meant something," she smiled. "You didn't have to stay so calm either. But that meant something too." He chuckled lightly, feeling a small warmth return to his chest. He turned toward the door, ready to leave, when he caught sight of his reflection in the glass. Strong posture, calm face, eyes steady. He realized that sometimes the best response to hate wasn't shouting or arguing. Sometimes it was standing tall, showing the world that words couldn't break you. As he stepped outside, the wind brushed against his face. The city moved on as if nothing had happened. But inside that little coffee shop, something had changed. A few people had seen courage wrapped in quietness. A few hearts had softened. And maybe, just maybe, someone inside was thinking twice about the power of their words. David walked down the street, the sound of traffic filling the air. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. The moment was behind him, but the lesson was something that would stay, not just for him, but for everyone who had been there that morning. The next morning, the coffee shop looked just like it always did. The smell of fresh coffee drifted through the air, soft music played in the background, and people hurried in and out before work. But something had changed. The barista Mia couldn't stop thinking about what had happened the day before. The moment kept replaying in her mind. The cruel words, the silence that followed, and the way David had handled it with such quiet strength. She had never seen anyone stay that calm in a situation like that. When David walked in again that morning, Mia felt a strange mix of relief and guilt. She wanted to apologize again, but she also didn't want to make him remember something painful. He walked up to the counter with the same calm smile, though she could see a little weariness behind his eyes. "Good morning," he said kindly. "Morning," she replied, smiling back. "The usual?" he nodded. "Yeah, the usual." As she started to make his coffee, a few people in line recognized him. Some whispered to each other, realizing he was the man from the video that had started to quietly spread online overnight. The man who had stayed calm when someone told him to go back to Africa. They didn't know his name, but they remembered his face and his composure. David didn't know about the video yet. His phone had been buzzing with notifications, but he hadn't checked it. He just wanted his coffee and a few minutes of peace before another long day. He sat at the same table by the window just like yesterday. The morning sunlight poured over him, making his calm expression look almost peaceful. Mia brought him his drink and set it down gently. "Here you go," she said. He smiled. "Thank you, Mia." She hesitated, then said, "You handled everything really well yesterday." Most people would have shouted or stormed out. David looked down at his cup for a moment before answering. "It's not easy, but I've learned that shouting doesn't always fix anything. It just adds more noise," she nodded slowly. "Still, I wish I had spoken up sooner." He looked at her kindly. "You did speak up. You brought me that pastry." That small act meant something. Her eyes softened and she smiled, though her heart still felt heavy. She went back to work, but her mind kept returning to what he said. Maybe small acts really did matter. Across the shop, a man was sitting at a corner table scrolling through his phone. He was the same person who had recorded the incident. He had posted it online with a caption that simply said, "Grace under pressure." He hadn't expected it to blow up overnight. Thousands of people had already seen it, leaving comments about how moved they were by David's reaction. He watched David now, quietly amazed by how normal and humble he seemed, unaware of the impact he had already made. Just as things started to settle, the door opened and a familiar voice broke the quiet. "Oh, you've got to be kidding me," said a voice sharply. Mia turned and her heart dropped. It was the same woman from yesterday, the one who had made that cruel remark. She walked in, her face red from the cold outside, holding her phone tightly. She hadn't expected to see David there again. The room fell silent once more, tension filling the space instantly. David looked up, recognized her, and stayed quiet. He didn't look angry, just calm like yesterday. The woman, whose name was Linda, shifted awkwardly, realizing people were looking at her. She muttered to herself and stood in line, pretending not to notice him, but Mia could see that her hands were shaking slightly. Maybe she had seen the video too. Maybe she knew that the world had heard what she said. As Mia took her order, Linda avoided eye contact. "Just a small coffee, please," she said quietly. When she moved aside to wait, she kept glancing toward David. It was like she wanted to say something but couldn't find the courage. David, meanwhile, was staring at his laptop, pretending to work but very aware of her presence. After a few long minutes, Mia called out, "Small coffee for Linda." Linda took the cup, but instead of leaving, she hesitated. She turned toward David's table, her mouth opening slightly as if to speak, but then she froze. Everyone in the cafe seemed to be holding their breath. Finally, she walked over. Her steps were slow, uncertain. When she reached his table, she stopped. Can I talk to you for a minute?" she asked quietly. David looked up, his face neutral but not unkind. "Of course." She sat down across from him, her hands trembling as she set her coffee on the table. The entire shop was pretending not to watch, but every ear was tuned in. I wanted to say I'm sorry," she began, her voice shaky. "What I said yesterday was wrong. I was angry and impatient, but that doesn't excuse it." David watched her carefully. He didn't interrupt, didn't look smug or cold. He simply listened. Linda's eyes watered as she went on. "I didn't sleep much last night. My daughter showed me that video. I didn't even know someone had recorded it. Seeing myself say those words, I felt sick. That's not who I want to be." David took a slow breath before replying. "Thank you for saying that." She nodded quickly. "I know sorry isn't enough. I needed to say it to your face." He looked at her for a moment, his tone gentle but firm. "You hurt me with what you said, but I believe people can learn. That's why I didn't respond with anger. I wanted you and maybe others to see what calm looks like." Linda's lip trembled. "You didn't have to be kind. I wouldn't have been if I were you." He smiled faintly. "That's the thing about kindness. It works best when it's hardest to give." A few people nearby exhaled softly, the tension easing a little. Mia stood frozen behind the counter, her heart swelling with emotion. She'd never witnessed something like this, real change happening right in front of her. Linda wiped her eyes and said quietly, "I've been thinking about volunteering somewhere, maybe helping in a community program. I want to do something good, something that reminds me to be better." David nodded. "That's a start. Real change begins with one step." Linda looked down at her coffee, then back up at him. "I hope someday people forget about that video. I don't want to be remembered for that moment." David looked at her kindly. "People don't forget mistakes, but they remember what you do after them." Her eyes filled again, but this time it wasn't guilt, it was relief. She stood up slowly, still embarrassed but lighter somehow. "Thank you," she whispered. He nodded. "Take care of yourself." As she left the shop, the air felt different. The heaviness that had hung there for 2 days seemed to lift. The customers looked at David with quiet respect. No one clapped, no one spoke, but everyone felt something shift inside them. Mia came over again, a soft smile on her face. "You really are something, you know that?" David chuckled lightly. "I'm just trying to handle things one day at a time. That woman, She looked like she really meant it, Mia said. I think she did, David replied. Sometimes people just need to be seen, even when they don't deserve it. He took a sip of his coffee and stared out the window again. The street outside was busy, people rushing to work, cars honking, life moving forward. But inside that little cafe, it felt like time had slowed down long enough for everyone to learn something. The man in the corner who had posted the video watched quietly. He didn't expect another story to unfold, but he felt compelled to take one last photo, not to post but to remember. A photo of forgiveness, of two people sitting across from each other and choosing understanding instead of anger. Later that evening, David finally checked his phone. His notifications were full of messages, some from old friends, some from strangers. The video had been shared thousands of times. People were writing about how his calmness had inspired them, how his response had made them think. He scrolled through the comments, humbled by the words. But one message stood out. It was from Linda. She wrote, "Thank you for showing me what grace really looks like. I'm learning to be better." David stared at the message for a while before replying simply, "That's all any of us can do, learn to be better." He set his phone down and leaned back in his chair. For the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of peace. The world hadn't changed overnight, but something small had shifted. And sometimes that was enough to start something bigger. As the night deepened outside, David looked out the window and smiled faintly. The lights of the city shimmered against the glass, reflecting a truth he'd always believed. One person's calm could silence a storm. And sometimes one act of kindness could change more than words ever could. A few days passed, and life in the city continued like nothing had happened. The streets were still busy, people still rushed to work, and the little coffee shop still buzzed every morning with chatter and the smell of roasted beans. But for David, things weren't the same anymore. His quiet life had suddenly become very public. The video that man had recorded was now everywhere. Millions had watched it. People from all over the world were talking about him, the calm man who responded to hate with grace. At first, David didn't know what to think. His phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Messages from strangers poured in, some thanking him for inspiring them, others sharing their own painful stories of being judged or treated unfairly. He read each message slowly, his heart heavy but full. He had never asked for attention, but now that it was there, he felt a responsibility to do something meaningful with it. When he went back to the cafe that morning, Mia greeted him with a bright smile. "You're kind of famous now," she said playfully. He chuckled. "That's what they say. Still feels strange." "It's strange in a good way," she replied. "People are learning from what you did." David shook his head slightly. "I just reacted how I felt was right. I didn't expect any of this." As they talked, a few customers looked at him, whispering to one another. A young man in a suit approached his table nervously. "Excuse me," he said. "I just wanted to say that your video really hit me. My brother went through something similar, and seeing how you handled it, it gave me a new way to think." David smiled warmly. "Thank you. I'm glad it helped." The man nodded, his eyes full of gratitude, then left. Mia watched the interaction with a soft smile. "You're helping more people than you realize," she said quietly. David took a sip of his coffee and looked out the window. The thought of helping others made him feel grounded again. He didn't want fame, but if people could learn from what happened, then maybe something good could come out of all this. That afternoon, he received a call from a local community center. The director had seen the video and wanted him to come speak to a group of young people about handling anger and prejudice. David hesitated at first. He wasn't a speaker, and public attention made him nervous. But then he thought about it. Maybe this was his chance to turn something negative into something powerful. The next day, he arrived at the community center. It was a small place with colorful murals on the walls and the sound of kids laughing in the background. The director, an older man with kind eyes, greeted him warmly. "We're honored to have you here," he said. "What you did out there, it's something our young people need to see. Calm doesn't mean weak, and you showed that." David smiled humbly. "I'll do my best." He was led into a small hall where about 30 teenagers sat waiting. Some looked curious, others distracted, scrolling on their phones. When David stood in front of them, he didn't speak right away. He took a deep breath, looking around the room. "I'm not here to give a lecture," he began softly. I just want to share something real. The room quieted. Even the ones on their phones looked up. He continued. A few days ago, I went to a coffee shop like I always do. I thought it was just another morning. But someone said something hurtful to me, something that could have made me angry. And honestly, for a moment it did. But I decided not to let that anger control me. He paused, letting the words sink in. See, when you meet hate with hate, it just grows. But when you meet it with calm, it stops right there. It makes people think. And that's what I wanted to do, make her think. The room was silent now. Even the teenagers who looked bored a moment ago were listening closely. David told them about what happened next, how the woman came back, how she apologized, and how that apology changed something in her and in everyone who witnessed it. When you choose peace, he said, you don't just protect yourself. You give others a chance to learn. You remind them that kindness still exists. When he finished speaking, the room erupted in quiet applause. A few of the kids came up to him afterward, asking questions, sharing their own stories about being judged or misunderstood. One girl said softly, I wish I could stay that calm when people say mean things to me. He smiled gently. It's not easy, but it's possible. You don't have to be loud to be strong. As he left the center that day, he felt lighter. Maybe his story could help more people than he thought. Later that evening, Mia sent him a message. She had seen a new post about him online. Someone had shared a clip from his community talk, and it was spreading quickly, too. People were commenting things like, and this man is what the world needs right now. Others were saying how his story gave them hope. David replied to her message with a short line. Maybe this is the start of something good. The next morning, the cafe was busier than usual. News reporters had come by asking about him. Mia tried to keep things calm, but it was clear that everyone wanted to talk to David. When he arrived, people clapped quietly. Some thanked him, others asked for pictures. He smiled politely, a little embarrassed by all the attention. Among the crowd, Linda walked in quietly. She hadn't spoken to him since the day she apologized, but she had been following everything online. When she saw the positive impact her hurtful moment had unexpectedly created, she felt mixed emotions, guilt, but also gratitude that something good had come from her mistake. She waited until the crowd thinned before approaching his table. I guess you've been busy, she said with a small, nervous laugh. David looked up and smiled. A little. How have you been? She took a deep breath. Better, I think. I started helping at a local outreach program. Talking to people, listening more, learning. That's good, he said warmly. That's how change starts, by listening. Linda nodded, looking down. I keep thinking about what you said, that people remember what we do after our mistakes. I want to make sure I do better. He looked at her kindly. We all make mistakes. What matters is what we learn from them. For a moment, they sat in silence, both sipping their coffee. The tension that once existed between them was gone. In its place was something softer, understanding. Just then, a young reporter walked up, recognizing both of them. Excuse me, she said carefully. Would you two be open to doing a short interview together? I think people would love to hear how this story turned out. David looked at Linda, letting her decide. She hesitated for a second, then nodded. If it helps someone learn something, then yes. The reporter smiled and set up her camera. The interview was short but meaningful. David spoke about staying calm and compassionate even when it's hard. Linda talked about how shame turned into self-reflection and how kindness had opened her eyes. It wasn't about going viral anymore, it was about change. When the video aired, it touched even more people. Comments flooded in again, but this time many were about forgiveness. People wrote about how they had reached out to old friends, forgiven past hurts, or learned to control their temper. It was as if one moment in a small cafe had rippled out into the world. That night, David sat by his window at home, watching the city lights. He thought about everything that had happened, the hurt, the apology, the forgiveness, the connection. He never imagined that something so painful could lead to something so healing. He whispered to himself, maybe the world isn't as broken as it seems. Maybe it just needs more moments like this. The next day, when he walked into the cafe, people greeted him with smiles instead of whispers. Mia handed him his usual coffee and said, You've turned this place into something special, you know. He smiled softly. I didn't do it alone. Everyone who learned from it helped. The cafe was full again. Laughter, light conversations, the smell of pastries. Life had returned to normal, but with a warmth that wasn't there before. As David sat by the window sipping his coffee, he saw Linda across the room talking with Mia and a few regular customers. They were laughing together like old friends. It made him smile. He realized then that healing wasn't just about saying sorry. It was about rebuilding trust, about showing up differently each day. And in that little coffee shop, surrounded by people who had witnessed both cruelty and compassion, he felt hope grow quietly, like sunlight spilling through the window. The silence inside the cafe lasted longer than anyone expected. People had just witnessed something uncomfortable, something that made everyone look down at their cups and pretend to scroll on their phones. But the truth hung heavy in the air. It wasn't just about one rude comment. It was about the way people chose to stay quiet when they saw something wrong. David sat back down slowly. His coffee had gone cold, but that didn't matter. His heart was still racing, and his mind kept replaying the woman's words. He didn't want to hold on to anger. He'd learned long ago that anger only burned the person carrying it. Still, a part of him wondered if staying calm had really been the right choice. The woman sat at her table across the room, pretending to look at her phone, though her hands were shaking. A few people glanced at her and then at David. Some looked guilty for not stepping in. The barista Mia kept watching from behind the counter, her stomach in knots. She wanted to say something, anything, but the moment felt too delicate. Everyone was waiting for someone else to act. Minutes passed like hours. Then the man who had filmed earlier put his phone down and walked toward David. He leaned down slightly and said, "Hey, brother. That was powerful. You handled it better than most people could." David nodded politely, grateful but still distant. He wasn't trying to be a hero. He had only wanted to drink his coffee in peace. A few people quietly approached him to show support. One woman said softly, "You shouldn't have had to go through that." Another nodded, saying, "I'm sorry we all froze. We should have spoken up." Their words helped, but what meant more to David was the sincerity in their eyes. The woman across the room was still quiet. Her earlier boldness had faded. She looked like someone realizing a terrible mistake. She kept glancing toward David, but he didn't look back. He focused on the window instead, watching cars move along the street, trying to calm the storm inside. After a while, Mia couldn't take it anymore. She walked over with another cup of hot coffee and placed it gently in front of him. "This one's on the house," she said softly. He looked up, surprised. She gave a small smile. "I should have said something earlier. I froze, and I'm sorry." David shook his head. "You don't need to apologize. It's not your fault." "Still," she said, looking around the room, "I don't like what happened here. It didn't feel right." David smiled faintly. "Then make sure it feels right next time." Her eyes softened. "I will." She turned and walked back behind the counter. Something about that small exchange changed the mood of the cafe. It wasn't as tense anymore. People began to whisper to each other, not gossiping but reflecting. The woman who had made the comment couldn't ignore it anymore. She stood up, clutching her purse, and slowly walked over to David's table. The cafe grew quiet again. The sound of her heels clicking on the floor echoed with every step. She stopped beside his table and took a deep breath. "Excuse me," she began, her voice low. David looked up, calm but cautious. "I wanted to say..." She paused, looking down at her hands. "I shouldn't have said that." It was wrong. David didn't interrupt. He just listened. "I don't know why I said it," she continued. "Maybe I was just frustrated. But it was ugly, and I'm ashamed." Her voice trembled a little. "You didn't deserve that." The cafe was so quiet that even the hum of the fridge behind the counter seemed loud. Everyone was listening. Some people looked shocked to see her apologize at all. David finally spoke. His tone was gentle, not bitter. Words can hurt more than people realize. But what matters is what we do after we say them. She nodded slowly, eyes glistening. "I know. I'm sorry." "Thank you," he said simply. The woman wiped her eyes and turned to leave, but before she did, she looked at the others in the cafe. "I hope none of you ever speak like I did today," she said quietly. Then she walked out. No one clapped. No one cheered. But everyone felt something shift. The moment had gone from anger to awareness. People went back to their drinks, but the mood was different now. Softer, more thoughtful. David sat back and took a sip of the new coffee Mia had given him. It was warm and sweet, and for the first time that afternoon he felt a sense of peace. Not pride, not satisfaction, just peace. Mia came over again later, wiping down tables. She said quietly, "You handled that better than I could have." Most people would have shouted back. David smiled. "I used to think shouting was the only way to be heard. But sometimes silence and calmness speak louder." She nodded. "You made a point without yelling." "That's rare." "People listen more when they don't feel attacked," he said. "And maybe she'll remember this moment next time she feels angry at someone who doesn't look like her." Mia thought about that for a long moment. Then she smiled and said, "I think she will." Later that day, as the crowd thinned out, the man who had recorded the video approached David again. He asked carefully, "Would you be okay if I shared what happened?" Not to shame anyone, but because the way you handled it was powerful. People need to see that kind of calmness. David hesitated. He wasn't looking for attention, but maybe, just maybe, someone watching would think twice before repeating the same mistake. He finally nodded. "If it helps someone understand, sure." The man smiled. "I'll share it respectfully. Thank you for that." David nodded again, and the man left the cafe. As the door closed behind him, David looked around. The tension that had filled the room earlier was gone. People smiled at him now, not out of pity but respect. When he finally stood up to leave, Mia waved goodbye and said, "Take care of yourself, all right?" "You too," he replied. As he stepped out into the sunlight, David took a deep breath. The air felt fresher somehow, like he had walked through something heavy and come out stronger. He didn't know what the rest of the day would bring, but he did know one thing. Sometimes the smallest acts of patience can leave the deepest mark. Across the street, the man who had filmed was already looking down at his phone, typing a caption before uploading the video. It wasn't long before it started spreading, shared by strangers who were moved by the quiet strength in David's voice, by the way he turned hate into a lesson instead of a fight. Back inside the cafe, Mia stood behind the counter, staring at the empty chair where David had sat. She felt changed, too. She had seen what grace looked like, and it made her want to be braver the next time she saw something wrong. Even the customers who had stayed silent earlier were now deep in thought. Some sent texts to friends about what they had just witnessed. Others simply sat there, thinking about the times they had stayed quiet when they shouldn't have. Outside, David walked slowly, blending into the crowd. The city moved on, but something in that little cafe had shifted forever. The world didn't change in one moment, but maybe, just maybe, a few hearts did. That evening, when David finally got home, he turned on his phone to find hundreds of notifications. He didn't understand at first. Then he saw the video. It had already gathered thousands of views. People were commenting things like, "This man showed what real strength looks like, and we need more people like him." He smiled faintly and put the phone down. He hadn't planned to go viral. He had only planned to stay calm. But maybe that was exactly what the world needed to see. He sat by the window looking out at the city lights. Somewhere out there, the woman was probably replaying her own actions too. He hoped she would learn from them. He didn't wish her harm, only growth. As night fell, David closed his eyes and took another deep breath. He thought about his father, who used to tell him, "Son, people will try to bring you down. Don't meet them at their level. Show them what grace looks like." He smiled at the memory. That advice had never felt more real than it did today. The next morning, when David woke up, his phone was still buzzing. More people had seen the video. More messages poured in. But instead of excitement, he felt something else, a quiet sense of purpose. Maybe his calmness had started something small, something that could grow. He didn't know what would come next, but he was ready to face it with the same strength he'd shown in that cafe. The world had seen his patience, but only he knew how much it had taken to hold it together. He picked up his jacket, ready for another day. Before leaving, he looked at his reflection in the mirror and whispered to himself, "Stay calm no matter what." Then he walked out, carrying not anger but quiet confidence, the kind that could change hearts. One mo. The video spread faster than anyone could have imagined. Within a day, it was everywhere. Shared on social media, posted on news pages, and even shown in classrooms where teachers discussed how to respond to hate with calmness. People from different countries commented, saying how touched they were by the man's composure and kindness. The comments weren't just about him. They were about hope, about how one person's reaction could change the way others saw the world. David didn't expect any of it. When he went back to work that Monday, people were staring at him differently. Not with judgment, but with quiet admiration. A few co-workers approached him in the break room, one saying softly, "I saw the video, man. That took courage." Another added, "You handled that better than anyone I know." He smiled politely, but didn't say much. Inside, he was still processing everything. He hadn't done it for attention. He had only wanted to show respect to himself, even when someone else didn't. But now the world was watching, and that made him nervous. Later that day, he got an email from a local journalist asking for an interview. At first, he hesitated. The last thing he wanted was to turn this into fame or attention. But after thinking about it, he realized it might be a chance to speak about something bigger than himself. Maybe his story could help someone else stay calm in a moment of anger. That evening, he agreed to meet the reporter at the same cafe where it all happened. When he walked in, the staff greeted him warmly. Mia smiled from behind the counter, waving at him like an old friend. "You're kind of famous now," she teased lightly. He laughed softly. "I didn't mean to be." "Well, you earned it," she said. "You showed people something powerful." The reporter arrived a few minutes later. She was polite and respectful, setting up a small recorder and asking questions about what he felt that day. David answered honestly. He talked about the hurt, the pause before he spoke, and the decision to stay calm. He said, "I didn't want to add more hate into the world. I just wanted to show there's another way to respond." When the interview aired the next morning, people connected with his words. They didn't just see him as a victim. They saw him as a symbol of grace under pressure. Messages poured in from all over. Students, teachers, even police officers, thanking him for showing restraint and strength. Meanwhile, somewhere across the city, the woman who had insulted him saw the video too. She watched it several times, each time feeling more ashamed. She couldn't believe how cruel her words had sounded when replayed. She realized that while she had been angry and impatient that day, he had shown her more dignity than she had shown him. It haunted her in a good way, the kind that pushes a person to change. A few days later, she sent an email to the cafe asking them to forward a message to David. It read, "I don't expect forgiveness, but I want you to know I've been reflecting a lot. I started volunteering at a local community center, trying to learn and unlearn things I should have faced long ago. Thank you for responding with kindness instead of hate. You taught me something that day." When David read the message, he sat in silence for a long moment. Then he smiled gently. He didn't need to reply. The fact that she was trying to change was enough. Over the next week, life slowly returned to normal, but something inside him had shifted. He started getting invitations to speak at schools and community centers. At first he refused. Public speaking wasn't his thing. But then he remembered his father's words. "If you see a chance to make something right, don't stay silent." So he accepted. His first talk was at a small high school auditorium. The students sat quietly as he spoke about patience, dignity, and how calmness isn't weakness, it's power. He told them, "It's easy to react with anger. What's harder is to respond with peace. But that's how you change hearts." When he finished, the students clapped. Some even came up to thank him personally. One girl said softly, "My brother gets treated badly because of how he looks. I'm going to show him your video. It'll give him hope." That one sentence made all the attention worth it. As the weeks went by, the video continued to spread. It reached not just social media, but news shows, podcasts, and even community workshops. People shared it not for the drama, but for the message, that calmness, respect, and understanding could change the outcome of any hateful moment. But David stayed humble. He still went to the same cafe for coffee every morning. He still sat by the same window. The only difference was that now, people would smile at him when they walked in. Some would quietly nod or say, "Thank you for what you did." Mia sometimes joked, "You know, you made our cafe kind of famous." He laughed. "I guess it wasn't the fame I was expecting." "Well," she said, "you turned a bad day into something beautiful. Not many people can do that." He thought about it for a moment and said, "Maybe that's what the world needs, a few people turning bad moments into lessons." As time went on, people began to forget the viral part of the story, but they didn't forget the message. Schools used the clip to teach empathy. Churches used it in sermons about forgiveness. Even workplaces played it during diversity meetings to talk about how respect can transform conflict.